suggest that if I were an active politician, and if I would look for something extremely simple so that I could really use my hands how to operate, then the number that I really think is crucial is the number of measuring employment. Now, of course, once you say the word employment, immediately there are a number of problems. The problem number one is to distinguish between true unemployment, or more specifically, the employment rate. But then there are other issues: underemployment, and that is not easy to distinguish; misemployment, and that's also not easy to distinguish, and so on. But nevertheless, it seems to me that in order to carry the economic part of the policies, it would be very good to rather rely on the data on employment rather than maybe on anything else. But these are just the only thing I wanted to say. So, my dear friend, the floor is yours, and you can invite Gary.
Good afternoon. In my short presentation, I'm going to endeavor to answer really only one question, a very important question and a very controversial question on which there are many views, and that is full employment possible? Obviously, when we're talking about it, we're talking about many different situations around the world, and therefore any set of prescriptions may be relevant in some places and not in others, and therefore in a forum like this it doesn't make any sense to try to come up with a final package of recommendations that's going to work everywhere. It has to be context specific. But I'd like to make the case, and I'm telling you in advance, that I believe the answer to this question is emphatically yes. Full employment is possible. Is full employment possible or likely under what we are loosely terming the existing paradigm? I would argue on a national basis, in some places, sometimes it may happen, but on a global basis, it's very unlikely to happen in the near future. And therefore, a new paradigm is fundamental and essential for achieving this goal, which Ivo has already said ranks extremely high among the overall goals, and I'll come back to that later. I'd like to start just with a little historical perspective, comparing the situation in 1800 and 2012, essentially to indicate that in the last 200 years, global society has undergone radical changes which have involved enormous stresses, in the sense stress to our capacity for rapid adjustment. Population has grown more than 7-fold. Urbanization has grown more than 16-fold. In addition, our life expectancy has doubled, which means we have more people around for a long time. We have introduced enormous amount of mechanization, technology, and automation, starting 100 years, really 140 years ago. We've shifted our primary field of operation from agriculture, from the land, to the factory, to the society, to the company, to the marketplace, to government, out of the rural area, into a whole new sphere which we call either the industrial or the service economy. And I've given the data here. In 200 years ago, 85% of the world's population was involved in agriculture. Today, 70%, at least in the OECD, is in the service sector, not even in manufacturing. And that figure on the global basis is probably, well, probably around 55 to 60%. And at the same time, world trade has grown exponentially. Why are these things important? Our common sense, conventional wisdom about employment, something that most of us believe and we read all the time in the paper, is the problem of unemployment is the result of three things. Very rapid growth of population. Naturally, if too many people are being born and entering the workforce at one time, we don't have enough jobs for them. I say naturally because that's the prevailing belief. Second, mechanization. We all have this sense that machines are taking over so many of the things we used to do ourselves, so it doesn't surprise us if somebody says that we're running out of jobs. And even if they predict that in future unemployment's going to rise higher and higher, seems to be common sense. If computers are doing everything we're doing, then there'll be nothing left for us. And of course, world trade, the third factor, and that is all our jobs in the OECD countries presumably are going over to countries with lower wages. Now, the interesting thing about this 200-year period is unemployment has not suddenly become a concern. At every critical juncture in our transition through this period, we have experienced periods of peak unemployment. In the United States, for example, in the 1890s, when there was a movement away from agriculture into industry, away from rural to urban areas, we had rising unemployment, and the prophecy at that time was unemployment is going to perpetually plague society, and there's no remedy for it. The machines are taking over. It turned out to be a very short-lived period before the growth of the consumer economy, the growth of the middle class, led to a rapid growth of jobs, and this problem or debate about unemployment fell until the 1930s. After the Second World War, employment grew all over the OECD at rapid rates, and we were doing just great up until about 1991, when suddenly the Cold War ended, Berlin Wall was gone, Germany reunified, the whole global economy went through a period of adjustment, and Europe particularly experienced high levels of unemployment, particularly in Germany because it absorbed all of Western Germany, and then the East European countries that went through a radical economic transition from one system to the other. And there were many predictions in the early 90s that unemployment, that we're at the end of work. We better just be thinking about what we're going to do when nobody or very few people have jobs. And yet by 2000, if you look at the articles and the media and everything, very few people were talking in the Western world about the shortage of jobs or a perpetual problem of unemployment. Doesn't mean that everybody had jobs, but this sense of doom was gone. If we look at the actual figures, and I've just taken the last 60 years, overall trends, during this period, population has grown about 184%, this is globally. Working age population grew by about a little over 200%. Total employment in the world grew by 248%. That is faster than population, faster even than working age population. At a time when industrial technology and automation was going through its peak, and trade was also expanding at its peak. And the only thing I'm trying to make out of this is that data does not support any type of long-term vision that population growth, automation, or trade is counter to the achievement of a full employment society. Any of them can create dislocations. Any of them could, conceivably under certain policy frameworks, lead to unemployment or rising unemployment or even long-term unemployment, and we see that in pockets and in many places. And I don't mean to underestimate the problems we have, especially with youth unemployment, especially the problems in Europe today, more especially in Eastern Europe today. I'm trying to address the general issue. These trends are not inimical to achievement of a full employment economy. If we look a little more closely, globally, from 1950 to just before the most recent economic crisis, and I'd contend that one of the reasons we're so concerned about unemployment now is because of what happened in 2008, and if we were having this conference in 2007 or 2006, it would not have been nearly as high on the agenda, and hopefully 5 years from now it may not be either. You have more data here that essentially shows the same thing. Huge migration of the percentage of population out of agriculture. Manufacturing has grown, but our real growth has been in the service industries, and this is on a global basis. If you look at the OECD countries in the last 50 years, you'd see the top line. I know it's too small to read carefully, but the top line shows the employment to population ratio during this period grew from 40% to 71%. That means in 1960, only 40% of the population was working. Today, or in 2008, 71% of the population is involved in the labor force, of course, largely because of women entering the workforce. And yet, during that time, the levels of unemployment overall have been relatively static. That's the bottom line, the small one at the bottom, which you can't see. Unemployment has risen a couple of percentage points, but this huge growth in the percentage of people working. So I hope this data, it doesn't prove anything, but I hope it disproves the thing that we're up against some inevitable trend. I mentioned yesterday in my opening remarks what I would call a paradox of unmet needs and unutilized resources. Today, we have about 3 billion people, you can cut it in different ways, who are living below the minimum needs for survival and a decent life. And maybe it's 3 or 2.5 or 4, depending on what your standards are. But at the same time, we are living in a world that is afloat with underutilized and unutilized resources. About $4 or $5 trillion circling the globe every day looking for speculative returns. I mentioned also earlier the huge growth in global financial assets, very little of which, maybe 20% of it, actually being utilized to fuel the real economy and job creation. We have hundreds of millions of people who are unemployed, and if we look at them not from the point of view as a problem, how do we employ them, but as a resource that we're not utilizing, how can we have unmet needs of human beings when we have so many people who we're not using, who we're not giving gainful opportunity to utilize their skills? And as Ivo said, if you take underemployment into account, I'd say the minimum figure would be 1 billion, but I think more realistically, we'd be talking about 1/3 of the global workforce is underemployed. So how can we be suffering from a shortage of capacities to meet our human needs when we have such abundant resources available, human, financial, technological, and organizational? This suggests that our problem is not an incapacity to employ people or to give them gainful ways. After all, if I have capacities, I should be able to use them to support myself and to get what I need. There's something wrong with the system and the way it works. We neither meet all the needs that are there, nor do we utilize all the capabilities we have effectively. The The economists may say that we're maximizing economic efficiency by producing the most at the lowest cost, but I'd say from a social point of view, our system is extremely inefficient. We're wasting resources and missing opportunities. The next slide is intended to, there are two slides here. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you know, when we talk about how are we going to solve the employment problem, usually at the level of policy, the number of factors we consider are very few. Short term, we say, can we have a stimulus package? Or can we reduce the interest rate to push more money into the marketplace? But in reality, there are literally dozens of factors that are directly and indirectly impacting on the number of jobs that are created in the society. And any attempt to address this issue comprehensively should look at all of these factors and many more that I've not included on the list and see what can be done. And of course, there are efforts at the local level, regional level, national level to address many of them. But when it comes to a theoretical discussion of are there solutions, we usually limit the discussion to quite a few. Already, I think I've mentioned in earlier discussions, number 6 on this list. We have an economy today, we incentivize, during the heydays of the Industrial Revolution, the critical factor was to amass and concentrate enough capital for the capital-intensive investments needed for the Industrial Revolution. And so we've introduced very attractive depreciation allowances to encourage saving of money and channeling it into investments. We've kept very low levels of capital gains tax to encourage people to put their money into capital investments. We, ironically, at the same time, have been raising the cost of labor by taxing labor through payroll, by penalizing part-time work, by removing benefits from those who are in part-time work, by many other costs. So essentially we have a system by policy that encourages taking and emphasizing capital-intensive and natural energy-intensive investments, and discourages us from investments in human capital and utilization of human capital. I'm not at all suggesting that we give up automation and go back to doing everything by hand. I think the percentage by which we are off, that things need to be adjusted, only requires we eliminate the bias, an irrational bias, a bias that is unsustainable, a bias that undermines the sound ecology of the planet, and really utilize the one unlimited resource we have. Not unlimited in number, but unlimited in the potential for development, and that's the human resource. And our investments should be there, because the more we develop it, the more productive society will be. And there's a further list of items here, which as I said, we're not going to go through. One of them, number 19, income inequality. It was mentioned by Mr. Tokayev in his opening remarks. Very important, as we all know, that additional income to those who are in the highest income bracket, very little of that money goes for consumption. Very little of that money goes for creating investments in the real economy or in creating new jobs. So income inequality is not just a question of justice. It is a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed if we really want a society that provides welfare to all. Again, by way of generalization, I think there are many things that we can do all over the world, and I've worked for many years in India, and all that I'm saying here I think is as applicable to a developing country like India as it is to my own country, the US, or to countries in Europe. One I've already mentioned, and that is redirect money from speculative investment into the real economy. Second, remove the bias for capital-intensive investments. Improve the ease of doing business, which every World Bank report mentions. Promote entrepreneurship is often mentioned, but the second one is interesting. Reduce business failures. I saw a study some time ago in the US, I don't know, I haven't seen anything recently, that indicates roughly 80% of businesses go out of business in the first 5 years, and 80% of those that survive go out of business in the next 5 years, which means we're creating lots of companies, but very few of them survive. I'm a business consultant and have worked with many companies that have succeeded and some that have failed. And I know there are good reasons for this. There's enormous amount we can do to reduce business failures. We're going to be talking tomorrow about the importance of education. The theme has already come up. In many countries, the educational system is still geared towards just solely producing scientists or professionals, not really geared to giving everybody who comes out of it the skills needed to be a productive member of the workforce. There are many solutions to this. I'm going to just mention one from the United States, and that's the community college system, something which many countries like India could benefit enormously from. A lower level of higher education, normally for 2 years, that's not intended to end with a degree, but is intended to equip people with skills that will make them employable. It's been a tremendous success in the US, and certainly is applicable in many other countries. Another interesting point, a lot of studies have been done in the US. We look at enrollment rates in higher education, but if you look at dropout rates, and this I'm speaking now of the United States, it's much, much more true of many developing countries, we still have very high dropout rates in the high school range. The data, I didn't give it here, but the data makes it very clear that the lower the final level of education, the higher the rate of unemployment, and of course, the lower the level of earnings. So reducing the dropout rate even at the primary and secondary school level is an important driver. I'm going to just give you a minute to look through these, and rather than comment on them, the purpose being to essentially say, anything that accelerates and facilitates human networking, speed of decision-making, movement of information or products or people, anything that makes our society work more smoothly and rapidly is going to directly or indirectly stimulate, create jobs in one way or another. So think of society not as an economic engine. Think of it as a social networking device that helps us relate to one another to meet needs and tap opportunities. Anything we can do that will streamline the connections and interactions between people will also help directly or indirectly to create greater job opportunities. I'm just going to be concluding now with a few summary statements. I think what we need in a new paradigm, and this is something I should have prefaced, this is something the World Academy we've been working on for a long time. We've been working with Club of Rome on it, and who conducted a conference on it a few years ago. We've published quite a bit on it in our journal, Cadmus. So I'm kind of summarizing something that we've come to. It's not my own individual view, it's something we've come to as a conclusion over a long time. And that is, first, as Ivo said, employment is not a luxury, it's not just for the rich or the lucky. Employment is absolutely essential for the social stability of society, for the political stability of society. If we don't create the jobs that are necessary, we are creating increasing uncertainty, increasing instability. In many places, we'll be creating higher crime rates, violence rates, fundamentalism, and conflict. So we don't really have a choice, but we do have an opportunity. Human capital, a human capital intensive strategy is a strategy that can meet this need. But we would go further and say, today we don't live in societies where anybody can go and do anything they want in order to earn their living livelihood. Our society is so structured, it's got so many laws, regulations that inhibit and tell us what we cannot do. We can't plant things here, we can't produce things there, we can't build our own houses or run our own electricity, and so forth. We're so regulated. We live in a society where somebody who has surplus income can do anything they want with it, even if it destabilizes the global economy, but we don't have we're not protecting the fundamental right of everybody for gainful employment. But we live in a society where a job in some form or other, some form of income generating mechanism, is essentially the economic equivalent of the right to vote in democracy. If we don't have that source of income, we can't exercise our rights in the economy. And therefore, it needs to be regarded much more as a fundamental right than as something that some people have and have access to and others don't. That may sound very far-reaching, but the fact is, way back in the early 40s, just during the early years of the Second World War, President Roosevelt drew up the first draft of what he called a second Bill of Rights. He called it a Bill of Economic Rights, and the first item on that list was the right to employment. And his plan was, as soon as the war was over, he wanted to push this through, because he recognized that it doesn't mean we become a communist or socialist society in which government employs everybody. It means the government has a responsibility to introduce policies that will create that right for everybody. Unfortunately, he died before the end of the war, and before that could be done. But there's a whole history of recognition, both at the national and international level, that employment really needs to be regarded as a fundamental human right in order for people to survive in modern society. 20 years ago, the International Commission on Peace and Food was addressing this issue, and in their report to the United Nations, they said, recognizing the right of every citizen to employment is the essential basis and the most effective strategy for generating the necessary political will to provide jobs for all. One of the problems today is the unemployed don't have a constituency. That we're, in most countries anyway, the unemployment are not big enough or organized enough to exert political will for what they want, and they have no legal basis to make demands. They can only express unrest and discontent with the status quo. So the very decision of government to recognize the right to employment would give them the legal basis, would give them the basis, the constitutional basis for insisting on changes in policies which are in fact possible. I'd like to end just by posing some questions for discussion, recognizing we can't possibly deal with this whole issue in this afternoon session. So my three questions are: first, what policies are needed to create a full employment society? And I've listed a few categories. You could add to that, and maybe I've missed some important ones. Policies related to our pricing of natural resources. We discussed it in the last session, Rob Hoffman did. Policies related to technology adaptation and so forth, taxation. What changes are needed in the quantity, quality, reach, type, and content of education to support full employment, a topic I hope we'll come back to tomorrow morning in the session on employment. And three, what legal and constitutional foundations are needed to generate the political will for full employment? Thank you.
Так. Огромное спасибо, господин Джекобс. Ну, чтобы не остаться модератором без работы, я позволю сказать себе несколько слов. На самом деле, мне очень повезло, я попал в удивительную секцию, где собрались выдающиеся люди, и тема очень важная. Ну вот что я хотел бы сказать, может быть, нам тоже надо подумать. Дело в том, что в Советском Союзе все имели работу, понимаете, даже там заставляли работать. Но качество той работы, которое тогда было, не удовлетворяло многих. Поэтому удовлетворение от работы, чтобы человек не только получал материальную выгоду, но какую-то духовную вещь. Затем, я думаю, надо подумать над психологическими аспектами безработицы и другими вещами. Когда Бог изгнал Адама из рая, вы сами знаете, Он сказал, иди туда, понимаете, в поте лица добывай хлеб свой. Но одного хлеба, наверное, мало, имелось в виду и духовная пища. Вот насколько это должно соответствовать. Что касается диверсификации, я думаю, очень простая вещь есть, которая увеличила огромное количество работы и создал нормальную экологию. Это огромные военные расходы, которые в настоящее время составляют 30% мирового потенциала, скажем, бюджетного, так, расходовать не на оружие уничтожения, на посадку лесов, понимаете, что пустыни сокращать, прокладывать каналы, понимаете, и так дальше. То есть создавать нашу землю экологически нормальной. Я считаю, что в наше время две большие проблемы у нас перед человечеством. Две экологии. Это экология природы и экология души, называемая совестью. Ну, например, Ибн Сина говорил, что совесть, только та совесть больна, а здорова, которая болеет. Понимаете? То есть человек, если не болеет за свое окружение, не болеет за свое будущее, то эта работа не будет на удовлетворению. Поэтому прошу, кто желает сказать. Великолепный, пожалуйста, желающий высказаться. Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, Gary, for this very detailed analysis, and it was really very interesting. And you have listed here 3 questions, actually. And I think that there is one more, and this is the crucial question, actually. How could these very nice ideas reach the policymakers, and what is needed that they could approve and start to act? Your comments will be very welcome.
Пожалуйста, прям по ходу, наверное. Да, пожалуйста, сразу можете комментировать, чтобы был диалог живой.
Very brief comment. It's a very important question, Yuri, and I don't have the answer in a nutshell. I think that one thing I'm absolutely sure of, though, as long as we widely believe that there's no solution to this, we will not get the policymakers, we will not compel the changes necessary. As long as we don't realize the full costs of this to society, in terms of the unemployment, in terms of a study in the US shows that it costs more to the society for people to be unemployed than if the government simply paid them to work. I don't say paid them to stay home, but that's too possible, but just paid them to work. So I think right now we are so bound by misconceptions about unemployment that the first thing necessary is to address the issue and make us conscious that we have choices. And that if we are having unemployed people, especially high youth unemployment today, it's not inevitable. It's the result of existing policies which can be changed. So we have a choice. Today, I think there are very few people in the general public and many in policy positions that believe or understand that. So I would say I don't know what all the steps are, but I do think this is the first step. And I hope that in this session and in the one tomorrow, when we're talking about how do we bring about policy change, once we know about the changes we want to bring about, that this question will be debated. But I thank you for putting it on me.
Прекрасная дама просит слово. Первая попросила. Будьте любезны.
Gary, I'm so happy that I came to this session. There's a huge amount of overlap between this session and what happened in the morning on human capital. And one of the things that we talked about was unemployment, underemployment, and malemployment. I'm glad you think that full employment is indeed possible. It's not happening because perhaps you don't have the will to do what needs to be done. To give you an example, in India, you're very familiar with the situation in India. There are 2,500 different kinds of skills that are required across sectors. Yet, we have the age-old vocational training institutes, which are in complete disarray, which teach just about 20 to 30 areas of vocational training. In 70 to 80 areas. But we have 2,500 areas that can be taught. You remember there was this National Knowledge Commission in India set up by the Prime Minister. Dr. Bhargava was the Vice Chairman of National Knowledge Commission. Now the National Knowledge Commission had then, in 2008, suggested to the Prime Minister that vocational institutes in India must change completely, increase their scope, give it a little more dignity. And then they said that we need an agency that will do manpower planning, look at what kind of mismatch there is between requirement of services of industry and supply of the kind of people. You know very well that 80% of the graduates that we produce are unemployable. So that comes down to the quality of education that we have. So what are we teaching people? What are we producing? There is a complete mismatch. There is requirement, there are the people that can be given. But what needs to be delivered to these people so that they become useful to sectors that need them is something that's completely lacking. But we've also had several successful ways of successful solutions. For example, the cooperative movement. You know what happened? India brought in the white revolution, became the largest producer of milk in the world. And how did this happen? Cooperative system of bringing all the milk producing little farmers together, and they made the country the largest producer of milk. We had rural women who came together and said, all right, what is it that we can do? I mean, we have to bring an income into the families. All we can do is roll papad. Now, I don't know how many of you know what papad is. It's lentil that's ground into a paste and rolled into a very thin dough, dried in the sun, and then that's something that you can keep for a long time. Now, you deep fry this in oil, and you get a wonderful fritter. It's called papad. And papad is eaten all across the country. So these women came together and said, all right, we'll set up a cooperative, and they started what's called Lijjat Papad. And it's a huge success. Now, we have these models. I don't know why we don't follow this. Agriculture, there's tremendous need in agriculture today. So much can be done with farm produce that goes complete waste. At times we have a bumper crop. We produce far more than what is required. And that is as much a curse, it's not a blessing, is as much a curse as a drought when you don't produce anything. Because all your farm produce goes down the drain. We haven't found ways and means of converting this produce into something that can be sold and distributed in places where you don't get them. So we have all these solutions, but somehow we don't have this will. Finally, innovations. If you look at innovations, the number of innovations we have in the unorganized sector, they far outnumber the innovations in the organized sector. Yet, the money that banks will provide, the money that venture capitals will provide, the money that angel investors will provide are only to those who come from the organized sector. I think this is the paradigm shift that we require. Thank you.
Пожалуйста.
Well, I think, Chandrika, you really gave an answer to Yuri, and I really enjoyed your response and agree to everything you said. We did a study in India in 1992 to see whether it was possible to create full employment. We developed a strategy, doesn't mean it is the only possible one, presented it to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. We never expected anybody to act on it. It was just a theoretical. They were so convinced by it, within 3 months they made it official government policy. And it was very much based on many of the things you mentioned, especially agriculture-led and agro-industry and marketing and so forth. And there are practical ways to do it. By that time, the government changed, and that's the old government. So I think the point that you've made is, it's not, you've reinforced what I was trying to say. It's not that there is no way to do this. If our institution of education are deficient, or our institutions of government that are involved with policy implementation, then we know the problem is not with jobs. The problem is elsewhere. I just add one point, because your comments on vocational training were so appropriate. We gave a proposal to the Indian Planning Commission in 2001 for the introduction of computerized vocational training, exactly for the reason you say. The existing Indian technical institutes are training a few skills 30 years behind the time. The number of breadth of skills needed. Pilots learn how to fly airplanes by computer simulation. Many, not all, but many skills could be learned by computer. We talked to Microsoft and other companies, Abtech and companies like that. Would they be willing to support an effort like this, which could be a self-employment effort, could promote entrepreneurship and everything? The Planning Commission said, oh, this is very interesting, but it remained there. So I think the point of this is, it's not that there's a shortage of opportunities. If you remember in the late 60s, 80s, when Sam Petroda introduced the STD booths, the long-distance dialing booths, they created 1 million jobs, self-employed jobs in a few years by a new social strategy. So, thanks for your comments.
Спасибо за интересное выступление, интересный ответ. Слово вам. Ага.
Thank you, Yuda Kahana from Israel. I'd like to make a few comments. First of all, I would have changed the topic of the session. Instead of just saying employment, the more important thing is the security in employment, because employment is a question related to age and whatever. You like to find the security of income from employment. It is even more important to guarantee that pensioners can have a living, and if they are unemployed for a period, that their rights will be preserved, etc. So that's the first comment. This is especially true because we didn't relate to certain characteristics of the new economy. In the new economy, the know-how that you have while employed does not remain forever. It gets obsolete after a while, in certain areas very quickly. And therefore, we find people at a fairly young age, like 40 or 50, that suddenly find themselves unemployed, and they feel as if they are unemployable because they didn't have the time to readjust, and they didn't think about the need to readjust and to learn new things and to develop. And it should be not only the responsibility of the employees to adjust themselves, but also the responsibility of the employers to guarantee that they keep these people employed, especially that not all people are prepared to be self-employed. you assume as if everybody can be self-employed. It's very difficult to be self-employed. It requires special skills. Some of them can be learned and most of them cannot be learned. And it's a question of entrepreneurship is something that comes from within the person, and if that person doesn't have it, then he or she will fail. And I've seen very successful people. For example, I remember some managers of in the financial sectors that got particular proposals to retire early, and they got a lot of money, and they said, well, we prefer to make a business, and we have been in the business, in the banking, for example, and we probably know the best how to establish a business, and they failed and they lost all the money because they didn't have the same talent that are needed, and they didn't know how to deal with the bureaucracy. Suddenly they saw that the bureaucracy how bureaucratic their counterparts are, and how bad they were when they served on the other side. And that's the second point. In the past, I was educated in Israel when Israel was just declared its independence. I was in the first grade, and the country at that time was more socialistic, on the verge of communism, and we had many things that maybe our friends from Kazakhstan will understand better than other people. First of all, we had more mutual responsibility. Somehow we preferred the interest of the group over the interest of the individual, to a certain extent, and that helped in work and in other places because it called for more cooperation between people. And also at that time, it was, everybody felt as if it is clear that you have the right to be employed. And now this is not self-understood anymore. And of course, when you have strong unions and you have the feeling of that the right to be employed is a right, it affects the quality of work, and people lose incentives to excel and to develop and whatever. So the incentives should be kept there. I think my friend made this point, and I don't want to elaborate on it. The last point that I like to talk about is that when we create a policy, 2 points. When we create a policy, maybe we should think about the experiment that they had in the Scandinavian country. I think it was Rasmussen from Denmark in the 60s that defined the policy of flex security, and which was sort of a treaty between the unions, between the workers, between the government, and between the employers, to make sure that they keep the people employed in the business, keep their education and whatever, because when you fire people, you lose a lot of talent and experience that's getting lost. And a minute after these guys retire, it becomes very difficult to bring them back to work. And although they would like to go back to work, but it's very difficult to do it. So it has to be thought. Another aspect of the new economy is that the new economy is economics of information and know-how, and computers and IT. Many things could be done with computers, and we have to change the mode of employment to a different setting, that people would stay at home, it will involve and work from home, and will drive less and will pollute less. So it's part of a combined solution, and it's very difficult to just talk about employment per se. In the organization that I set in Israel, it's a non-profit organization. We took upon ourselves a mission to voluntarily advise the government on the employment issue. On May 1st in Israel was celebrated as the Labor Day. It's not September 1st. Okay? You know what I'm talking, with the red flags and whatever. So, and in recent years it disappeared. But on May 1st this year, we announced a new project of work security and employment security. And what we did, we called a group of people that wanted to volunteer to this job, and we just made sure that they came from all sectors, from all age groups, from gender, from various levels of employment in the past, and the employers, employees, and whatever, and Arabs, Jews, whatever. And we asked them about their vision, personal vision on the topic, because the only way to plan something, there is no way to plan the future. The only way you can do is to create a vision and set it as a goal, that agreed goal that everybody agrees to it, and then work backward to the present. And then what should be done is so clear, you don't have to answer those questions anymore. They are answered automatically within hours. It's not a job for thousands of people. And so we were trying to, and we are trying to do this. We are doing it. We are not trying. We are doing it. When you try, you don't do anything. We are doing it, and we have the obligation. We took upon ourselves the obligation to submit a full document on the May 1st, the coming May 1st. And the things that we learned from these groups, from their visions, is fantastic. The group has changed. Suddenly the government, the top level of governments suddenly appeared in our meetings. The heads of the unions came. The largest employers in Israel came and are participating voluntarily in trying to solve this issue. And that's the only way to do it that I know, is to work from the future to the present. So I suggest to do this thing, and then you get all the answers. You talk with people and you get their visions. And then the question is how to compose it to one vision that everybody unifies to it. I thank you. I didn't mean to talk that long, but thank you.
Gary, I fully agree with you that total employment is possible. And thank you for the presentation you made. Now, don't you agree that the primary requirement for total employment is education of the right kind up to at least 12 years? So that's something that we must keep in mind. Now, we have an anachronistic situation in the country, in India. On one hand, we have a very large number of unemployed people. On the other hand, we have a very large number of unfilled positions, even at the higher level. You know, last December, the post of the Director General of Scientific and Industrial Research fell vacant. This is one of the highest posts possible in the scientific hierarchy in the country. And the post is still vacant. Can you imagine that the agency, which runs 45 national laboratories, is without a head? And there are 1,500 applications, not one of them is suitable. So that's an anachronistic situation.
Vice Chancellors.
That's right. Vice Chancellors of universities, those positions are not filled. And my last point is that we have a very skewed situation in the country, in India. 80% of people are employed in the unorganized sector, and only 20% are employed in the organized sector. In fact, the ideal ratio will be exactly the other way around. We would always have people employed in the non-organized sector, and that's a very good thing to have, but not 80%. It should be really 20%. So we have to ask as to why this is so.
May I make a comment, a modest attempt to reply to the question raised by Yuri about the overcoming a possible political barrier. And let me start with the fact that, as we all agree, we are now using the wrong measure. The wrong measure is GDP. So because of the GDP, for instance, European Union has introduced, not only European Union, the entire financial scale system has introduced various measures. Namely, if the particular country has a debt larger than whatever the percentage is, than the GDP of that country, then of course their general situation is worse and they can borrow with higher interest rate. They are supposed to undergo some austerity measures and things like this. Okay, so what politicians have thought of, they actually have realized that if you want to have the number better, if you want to have a smaller percentage of the debts with respect to GDP per capita, since you cannot decrease the debts, you can increase the GDP. So how do you increase the GDP? Then they thought of a marvelous idea. There is a so-called gray sector. And so they included mafia and they included the prostitution. These are the two numbers that you cannot easily assess what it is, and so they increase this. Okay, now if we would use the measure which I proposed at the beginning, rather than GDP, the employment, then of course governments, again, who are extremely clever, could do what has been done in many socialist countries previously. They could make unnecessary employment, you know, employ everybody. The famous joke which I remember from Poland at the time was some economists from the Western country came to Poland and saw two guys moving a simple cart that is usually a job for one man to be done. And then he asked, why you are two of you doing that, I mean? And the reply was, because the third one is on sick leave. So basically the governments do find always some kind of the things, but nevertheless I believe that the employment or employment rate or whatever is a better measure than GDP, or at least it should be imposed as a measurement always for all system to say, okay, what is your employment rate? And if the employment rate is low, no matter what, it should be done. The second comment I wanted to make is on the Yehuda's very important point of flexicurity. And the flexicurity, all of us who taught in United States University had experience of the following things. Once you had a grant, then you had to get postdoctorals. When you had postdoctorals, you knew that these postdoctorals are typically for 3 or 4 years. And then my job was always to find a job for them as soon as their 2-year period or 3-year period expires. So it was their job, but also my job. Why I was vitally interested? Because if I would not find a job for them, then I would not get excellent postdocs later on. So yes, this can be done, and I think again there is a way how to stimulate employers to look for jobs of their employee and make this flexible, the possibility, which by the way is done by any coach in any sport activity, where a coach can tell you you are not a goalie, you are supposed to be in some other place, but he finds the other place. I think that kind of the total responsibility of the entire system to find the best use of what I would like now not to use the word employment, but the one that was used this morning, human capital. Because if people are not employed, then their human capital is being depleted, destroyed, violated.
Пожалуйста.
An excellent presentation, Gary. Thank you. A brief point. In my opinion, reality is socially construed. And so unemployment is socially construed, as you pointed aptly out. But this narrative of unemployment is created by very tough reality, in my opinion, and I would want to know what you think. One way is that dysfunctional education, mechanicistic education, actually creates unemployment. When people are having a degree that is not fulfilling the present needs of society. Second, the people organize themselves in many countries with the guild, medical, doctor, lawyers, and all that. The research in the sociology of profession show clearly that the guilds in most countries do not work for the betterment of users of the service, but just as a medieval corporation, trade corporation, to benefit the holder of the coveted degree and specialization. So to make full employment, we need to make society more connected and more circulated. On one side, the need assessment. On the other, the training, the education, and the continuing education that is not on self-interest, but the group interest, society. And the last point is a question. What you said is great. It seems that the easiest thing would be to tackle at the level of a country. But what about, for example, a city, a municipality wanting to apply your idea? Can be done just at the municipality level, where this kind of variable are not in the power of a city council to change the law of the nation.
Пожалуйста. Нет, хочет ответить. Пожалуйста. Если можно, кратко.
Brief. I think it's a good question. There are obviously certain things that a municipality doesn't have control over. And therefore, the question is, but the municipality has an advantage. The closer you are to the grassroots ground reality, the more you will really see the opportunities. The problem with dealing at the national level is you're so macro that you look for something you can move at the national level. But what was several people have already commented about the educational system. Reinforcing the educational system, fine-tuning the educational system, like the proposal we discussed for Ljubljana, can be done at the level of even of a single university or a single school system. And give you one practical example, just so in Napa, California, 15 years ago, small city of 60,000, they called together companies. There are a lot of high-tech companies in the region, and they asked them, is there anything we can do better in the way we're educating our kids, even at this high school level? And they said it's very simple. They sat together and brainstormed for a day and came up with about 20 ways in which the education can be improved. And the first one on the list was, you educate students to work independently. Whereas when they come into our companies, and to compete with one another, when they come into our companies, they almost never work independently on anything. They have to know how to work as member of teams. And so they created a new high school in Napa. They could have used an existing one, but they started from scratch. And they redesigned the whole educational process that students were working in groups of 4. They were teaching each other. They were taking group assignments. They were much more active. And the results in the first 3 years were phenomenal. So it's only one example. I think when you look at I mentioned business failures. Business failures is difficult to address at the national level. It has to be addressed at the local level. If you really want to change attitudes towards entrepreneurship, as Yehudi said, not everybody's meant to be an entrepreneur, but many people could be entrepreneurial in different ways. The closer you get to ground reality, the more opportunity there is.
Thank you. Спасибо. Пожалуйста.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the connection of migration and employment, because it is these rights that the idea that you have full employment in a country, in a city. We have many areas of the world which in fact have economic migrants, and the question is, what is their fate in a global market? I talked a little bit about the Dominican Republic, which is really getting invaded by Haitian because of economic and environmental situations, and they do not know what to do with them. But there are many other examples connected with failed states, where in fact there are many people that are displaced persons. So the problem goes beyond borders, and that seems to be an area which is very difficult to tackle.
Пожалуйста, да.
Roberto, you've raised such
Тоже кратко, пожалуйста.
I'll try to be very brief. You've raised such an important issue which I didn't even touch on, which is so fundamentally important to the new paradigm, and that is many of the factors that are impacting on unemployment today are not under the control of national governments at all. In fact, a couple of years ago, working with Ian Johnson, who was the Secretary General of the Club of Rome, we drew up a proposal for a project on modeling. There is no, to my knowledge, there is no modeling of employment at the global level today. There is no theory of employment at the global level as far as I know. One example of that would be that when we say that unemployment is rising in US or Germany or somewhere else, if you look at it globally, the truth, it's misleading, because we did a rough calculation that about 40% of the US jobs are being created in China. US is creating jobs, but they're not creating them within the national boundaries for national citizens, which doesn't mean that doesn't mean that jobs are going out. They happen to be going to other places. So if you really want to understand what's happening in employment, we have to ask whether we can create full employment globally and not just locally. A second comment, I think, is it's one of the reasons, of course, and I think that's your point, one of the major reasons for migration is the lack of local employment opportunities, and therefore all the more reason to focus on addressing this issue where the shortages are. And of course, the movement of talent or skill from places where there are not opportunities being generated to places where there are is a natural mechanism to adjust. It doesn't mean it's the best way to go about it. What we lack today, we have national planning in many countries trying to address this, but there's really nobody that I know of. The one that would logically be doing it would be ILO, but they monitor what's going on, but as far as I know, we've talked to them and they're doing wonderful work. But they're still doing it at the national level. If we really want to look at this globally and see how we address it, we need to understand, we made a list, we identified about 37 factors that are outside the control of the national economy that are impacting on job creation in the economy, which is another argument for why we need to look at things globally.
Пожалуйста, кто еще желает? Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much for the wonderful conversation. I think it's been most productive. Just one small point that I wanted to make is that there is a great deal of work that is being done, some of which is not being done, but it generates no income. And so we have an institutional failing in not recognizing the value of that work. And if we did, I think it would impact favorably the distribution of income and include many more people in the productive provision of this kind of work. Most of it has to do with caring, caring for children, caring for sick, caring for elderly, and most of this caring that is not done in institutions is done without generating income. Thank you.
Пожалуйста.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Your report was a really comprehensive overview of the situation in employment. In regard of the feasibility of full employment, yes, probably it can be achieved. Because I have in mind some years back ILO was initiating decent work agenda, and at that time at the country levels people were actually very cautious. They were talking about the impossibility, even talking about decent work. It is not achievable at the current level of economic development of the country, but these days the government policies is really turning into the decent work agenda, and they are looking at how to achieve it. It means that full employment, if we are convinced on that, one will create a tool to achieve it, and then he will create a policy, involve the society, policymakers, and to work over that, and probably it can be done. In regard of these policymakers, I think ILO is a good platform to work with this with the country leadership. Because ILO, International Labour Organization, is a tripartite organization with the government. Actually, government already always is leading, but there is workers, it is the trade unions and employers organizations. The question may come up, why so far we are having troubles, and so far we are still discussing these issues in regard of employment, for example, unemployment. Governments are leading, yes, but for the time being, probably employers and workers, they should have more intensive dialogue between each other. First of all, they have to be independent, and they have to have a voice, a right of voice, which is the actually ILO is promoting. So the long list you have been offering for us was extended by the ILO in the framework of decent work agenda. It was not only in regard of creating of jobs, but guaranteeing writers' work, yeah? Extending social protection, which was actually mentioned here, social protection to promote inclusion and productivity, but ensuring that women and men enjoy working conditions that are safe, allow adequate free time and rest, take into account family and social values, provide for adequate compensation in case of lost or reduced income, and permit access to adequate health care. Social dialogue as well, I have mentioned this is there among workers and employers. In the time of recent crisis, which actually still going on, the ILO initiated the Global Jobs Pact. That was a kind of policy to respond to the crisis. At the International Labour Conference, most countries adopted this Global Jobs Pact, and at the national level, they have adopted national programs. Like in Kazakhstan it was employment roadmap, employment roadmap, short-term activities to support employment at that time. But gradually, it was at that in 2011. But today they have converted this roadmap into the national policy, employment policy. Now it is a bigger roadmap, and they are now creating new employment policy, which should be different rather than in the past. The first idea is to allow the people to have a right to employment, and to exclude them from the kind of social security net, not target the social assistance, because this dependency is not a good in this time. The people should go from self-employment stage to the employment stage. How it will be done, we are now working with this current government. So I do think that the possibilities for the government are open, and the ILO is providing this platform to discussion. There are a lot of ILO conventions. Actually, I need to say that almost all the countries all over the world are members of the ILO. We have a number of conventions which are directly or indirectly related to the employment promotion. There is a issue of ratification of convention. As soon as the country ratified, the country should follow the provisions of the conventions. So as soon as country doesn't ratify it, but anyway they have to report what they are doing on unratified conventions. So there are some mechanisms of working with the governments. And we have new leadership in the ILO. We have a new energy now, so probably we will continue to work, but we cannot do this alone. The countries' leaders should be with us, and because they are members and they have obligations according to the ILO constitution. Thank you.
Большое спасибо. Пожалуйста. Ну, вообще-то мы сейчас приближаемся уже к концу логическому. Наверное, после вас еще один человек выступит, кто наиболее очень крепко хочет сказать.
Профессор Сапанов, факультет востоковедения. У меня вопрос к Гарри, если Гарри... Джейкобсон. Вот вы когда ехали в Казахстан, вы, наверное, изучали ситуацию в Казахстане, да? Или как?
Yes, not in great detail, but yes, I did, before I came last year, I did do a survey of the economy and what was happening in the field of employment, yes. But I'm not an expert on Kazakhstan by any means.
И вот поэтому в ваших тезисах, там, 6-м, по-моему, 5-м пунктом выступала региональная интеграция, насколько я понимаю, для обеспечения занятости. Вот у меня такой вопрос к вам тогда. А почему тогда, когда Казахстан инициирует некоторые региональные интеграционные процессы, некоторые страны, западные страны, они выступают против интеграции? Ну, той же Казахстан с Россией, с Белоруссией, некоторые западные страны выступают против этой интеграции. Хотя вы говорите, что интеграция, она закроет некоторые бреши занятости. И вот 100% занятость, наверное, для Казахстана, она, наверное, еще утопична сегодня, потому что у нас очень серьезные проблемы постсоветского развития, и поэтому у нас быстро адаптироваться к тем реалиям, которые вы говорите, и которые представлены здесь нашими западными коллегами, для нас это немножко далековато, потому что да, мы адаптируемся к рыночным отношениям, но мы адаптируемся немножко по-другому, по-свойски, наверное, по-казахски адаптировались, да, потому что есть такие профессии, которые быстро освоили, это регулировщики, там, а такие реальные профессии, которые реально двигают экономику у нас такого еще нет. Поэтому вот идет переориентация, наверное, вот эти вещи, и поэтому нам несколько хотелось бы ваше мнение уточнить по этому вопросу. Thank you very much.
Может быть, я позволю ответить, господин Джейк?
Можно кому это вообще-то?
Господин Джейк, можно я отвечу ему? Вместо вас. А после вы дополните меня, если я так скажу. Значит, я думаю, что, уважаемый коллега, интеграция рознь, понимаете? И здесь вот за этим видеть какую-то очень такую политику, ущербную для нас, я думаю, это ошибочно. Значит, вообще вот этот Евразийский союз вызвал очень большую дискуссию в Казахстане, понимаете? И у него противников среди населения, интеллигенции было больше, чем его тех, кто поддерживал. Власть силовым образом это дело решает. Поэтому мне кажется, что этот вопрос очень даже не подлежит обсуждению. Конечно, у Запада есть свои интересы. Понимаете, они были и будут. Были интересы у России, были и у Китая. Эти интересы иногда переплетаются, схватываются и так дальше. Но для интересов Казахстана нужна интеграция с достойными партнерами, которые не подведут, которые нас будут вести вперед, а не назад, понимаете? Поэтому я думаю, что здесь этот вопрос должен сняться. Что
Но интеграция идет вперед, не назад.
Ну, я не думаю, что она идет вперед, понимаете? Много очень, вы знаете, в прессе было очень много доводов против этого положения. Так? Что касается тех вещей, которые у нас, то в Казахстане, к великому сожалению, понимаете, у нас было очень грамотное население. Значит, когда мы получили независимость, Казахстан была третья промышленность в Советском Союзе. Третья промышленность. По оснащенности, по другим делам. К великому сожалению, мы утеряли многие те позиции, которые у нас были. Заводы у нас сейчас стоят, значит, фабрики стоят. Простой пример. Казахстан, нефтяная держава, закупает бензин у России. По-моему, это вообще какой-то парадокс, понимаете? Казахстан, яблочная династия, яблочная страна, вчера только об этом говорили. Яблоки пошли из Казахстана, с наших холотов, понимаете? А мы яблоки завозим из Аргентины, из Польши, из Хорватии. Понимаете? То есть вот такие вещи, которые, в общем-то, в принципе, мы сами виноваты. Здесь никто не виноват. Я думаю, с нашими проблемами нам надо разбираться самим. Кто еще желает? Пожалуйста.
Есть же международный эксперт.
Нет, ну я думаю, что Гарри согласится с нами. Вы согласны со мной?
Now I have two questions. Your question and whether I agree with you. I think that your actual literal question was not whether we should integrate or not, but why are foreign countries advising against integration? And I think that's an easy question to answer, because they're advising against integration not by an evaluation of its economic impact, but an evaluation of its political impact, and particularly its political impact on them. So I think if you want to deal with this issue, we must really take it away from what foreign policy powers are saying and look at it objectively. I have not done that study in this particular region, but as a general principle, I'd say that yes, regional integration can be of immense value, not just in employment, but in exchange of ideas in many different ways. So leave it general and just say my view is apolitical and not specific to this region, because I'm not informed enough about it. But I don't necessarily agree with the experts if it's coming from the West.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста. Вот, пожалуйста.
Сена Гульдосова, Казахский национальный университет. Thank you, Gary, for your excellent presentation. And actually, I'm sure a lot of your ideas you have presented, but not as a politician, but as an educational representative, I would like to share some points about the issue and questions you have raised in the last point. As in India, Kazakhstan also faces with one problem. I mean, now official unemployment rate is almost about 8%, but the employment itself actually in Kazakhstan is more self-employed people, normally. What's problem? The problem is that after several decades of investing in education, higher education, vocational, professional education, we still face with the situation when demand is not matching supply. Supply of the highly educated people is more than needed. Why? The problem here is raised not only by the unemployed people, but also by our government. Actually, you are very right by saying that the employment is not privilege, it's the right. This right of Kazakhstani citizens is actually recognized by Kazakhstani constitution. Yeah. And our government also is concerned with the problem. Why is this match in labor market with supply and demand? The problem here it is that many of academic programs like MBA, MA, Bachelor, BA, many of them are out of date. But this question was raised up 10 years before, and I'm in controversy with my colleague. I would say that our educational system now is changing too. The example is Kazakh National University, our university. We are required to design all our programs taking into consideration the demand of the market, to research the market demand, what kind of workers the market needs. So some change are there. The second point here is the very rapid change of technology. You know, the educational system is follow the change in technology. That's pity. And maybe the challenge for us to be more forward-looking and give the feed-forward control rather than feedback control. This point. The next is that after the Soviet Union was collapsed, or after our independence, the system of vocational training, secondary education, professional education was totally destroyed. And if we want to adapt to market demand, we have to develop vocational education, short-term program. And the psychology of many graduates is, if I will get the, for example, MBA degree, I will get a good job. So that's wrong point. To be employed, you have to adapt to the market demand, not only to get 1, 2, or more professional degree of higher education. And that's why, as I see, now we are recovering the system of vocational training, but we have to adapt it more to the market demand, not higher education, but vocational training system. And the last point, my point, is that the concept of the full employment, for me personally, actually it's like a concept to make all people happy. For me, it's not achievable. Because you said about the government responsibility, for the people